All right, so I am pleased to introduce today, for the last period of the day, Shawna Williams, and she's presenting action-oriented feedback. Shawna has a master's in education and is an instructional resource coordinator with the Language Instruction Training and Support Network, LISTN, working with LINC instructors across the province of BC. She is also the president of BC TEAL Board of Directors. If you have any questions or any issues, please let us know in the chat box and we'd be happy to take care of that for you. All right, so take it away, Shawna.
Okay, so I'm pleased to offer a workshop on action-oriented feedback. I've done this a number of times in face-to-face settings, so today should be quite interesting doing it online. Uh-oh. Fataya can't hear me. Audio is muffled.
You're fine, Shawna. I can hear you.
Okay. Let's just go through then. Hopefully everyone can follow along okay. All of the workshops that we do through LISTN, which is the Language Instruction Support and Training Network, we try to touch on various instructor competencies. And a few years ago with the province of BC, and back when LISTN was called LISTN, we worked to create a complete competency dictionary. And there are several different competencies that are associated with English language instruction. And so there are 3 that I have listed up on the slide today. And hopefully by the end of the 45 minutes or an hour that we have here, that will have helped to develop those competencies a little bit for all of the participants. In terms of an overview for today's presentation, I'm just going to go through defining some of the terms so that we all know what we're talking about when we refer to feedback, but also to go over some background, setting the stage for probably a lot of things that we already know. Then we're going to go through a writing sample, looking at various typical ways that instructors give feedback on writing assignments, and discuss whether or not those are action-oriented and how we can make them perhaps more action-oriented. And then we'll follow up and do the same with a speaking sample. And at that point, I'm actually going to get you to look into another website to listen to the video part and then come back and join the conversation. And then we'll wrap up with some other key points in terms of action-oriented research. Before we begin, I'm just very curious, and if you could raise your hand, how many of you work in a LINC context? Okay, so quite a number of you there. Maybe about half. Okay, and if you can raise their hands or put their hands down, I don't know what the technical term is for that. And those of you who work in, oh, Michelle is asking what I mean by LINC or a CLB. LINC specifically in terms of working with immigrant populations and the CLB curriculum for LINC, but it will definitely be connected to what we discussed with CLBs. And yet a lot of what I'm going to give you in the terms of this presentation will also cover EAP context or international school context. So just out of curiosity, how many of you are working in EAP programs? If you could raise your hand. Okay, so a handful of you there. And then finally, how many of you are working in or in ESP? Okay, Desiree, that's another one. And how many of you are working with international students, international school context? So it looks like we have a real variety of participants here in terms of what context you're coming from. And I think that this feedback presentation will be able to address concerns that come up in all contexts, even though specifically we're going to be looking at the LINC program. I see Scott from Kelowna is working with teacher educators, and I can tell you that as someone who works sometimes in a teacher education context myself, having done a lot of the work on feedback has really impacted the way that I teach my own teacher students and the kinds of feedback that I give to them. It's definitely given me food for thought. Okay, settlement worker, ESL instructor. So we've got a really nice variety of participants in the group today. So basically, in terms of feedback, it's information about our students right now and how that information is going to relate to various goals and standards. So it could be the students' learning goals, but also in terms of what the expectations are of the class or the institution and whatnot. So that's sorry, I just lost my train of thought there a little bit. That's the definition that I'm operating from for feedback. And generally, we all know what that is. In terms of action-oriented feedback, this is more specifically in that the feedback that we're giving to our students is going to involve some kind of a practical action. So there's a practical aspect associated with the feedback that we're giving to our students and to make it very useful feedback to help them move forward in their learning. An article that really helped to form the basis of a lot of this presentation is one called Formative Assessment in Self-Regulated Learning, a model and 7 principles of good feedback practice, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'll have a link for it, or not a link, but the information for it later on in the presentation. And I highly, highly recommend it for follow-up reading for those of you who want to engage a bit more in some of the research. But it's a fantastic article that goes through these particular principles of good feedback. And so basically, anytime we're giving feedback, we do want to make sure that we're helping to clarify learning goals of our students, to develop good reflection, not only reflection of the students, but reflection for the teacher. We're giving information to our students about their learning and our teaching. Our feedback encourages dialogue. It motivates and it encourages self-esteem. And what I have highlighted here today, because it's the focus of this presentation, is also that the feedback is action-oriented, and it helps to move our students from their current performance to desired performance. And then it also is going to help provide information to the teacher to shape the teaching. So it's a combination of what our students need, but then what we need to do as instructors to help our students to get there. I'm just seeing a comment from Haley about literacy and special literacy, as well as students at CLB 7 and 8 when stakes are higher in terms of time and further education, high school, college, and university. So Haley, I think you're referring to the context in which you're teaching there. Okay. So here's a hands up time. How many of you are aware of the sandwich approach for feedback? Quite a few of you. So it's a fairly common way that we give feedback in Canada and in North America. And basically, we're giving positive feedback first. Then we put in the constructive feedback, the area that people need to work on. And then we finish off with positive feedback. So sometimes it's called the sandwich approach, sometimes known as the feedback sandwich. And I see that Anonymous has said it's also known as something else. And that's exactly what I'm getting to. The sandwich feedback has another name. I'll let you fill in the blanks right there. And essentially, it's people really know what to expect when they're getting this kind of feedback. Or most Canadians know what to expect when they're getting this kind of feedback. So two things often happen with this. Yes, poor girl, right? So she knows that she's got a nice hat and that her top is nice, but she's just been told she's ugly. So she's going to not pay attention at all to the compliments because she's just devastated from having heard that negative or constructive feedback. And there's different ways that often this feedback can be interpreted. So the one is when you hear that positive feedback, you know what's coming next, so you ignore that positive because you're waiting for the negative feedback or the constructive feedback. And then again, you're going to ignore the positive feedback that ends the sandwich approach because that's where your focus is. On the other hand, some people will hear the positive feedback and they'll be on a real high that when that constructive criticism comes in the middle, they kind of ignore it. And then when it closes off on a positive, then it's reinforcing, and that the whole aspect of the constructive criticism is lost. And I was attending a workshop a few months ago with Lionel LaRoche. I don't know how many of you are aware of his work with cross-cultural communication, especially in the workplace. But he was saying, coming from France, it was a very difficult concept to come by, but also because he's an engineer, he looked at it in terms of the positive and negatives, and that in math, a positive plus a negative plus a positive results in a positive. So it might not always have the desired effect that we want it to when we give this kind of feedback. I need a drink of water. Something else that as teachers we often do is we give vague feedback. And in fact, there is an entire sticker industry that operates on vague feedback. And you do a Google image search and you can come up with so many different, smiley faces of great job, good job, way to go, keep going. And we tend to give this kind of feedback ourselves. It's not to say that this is totally useless. It's mostly useless. It can make us feel nice, that, oh, we got a good job or a thumbs up or a happy face. But it doesn't actually help us in terms of reaching our goals. And so we have to be very carefully balance how we use vague feedback, but to make sure that it's being used alongside constructive and specific, meaningful feedback. Sometimes it's totally useless, but sometimes it definitely serves a purpose. And across the languages, when I was teaching in Japan, I had a whole array of stamps and stickers that said the exact same things, but in Japanese. So, coming back to action-oriented feedback. This comes from the PBLA Guide 2014, which is the latest update for the portfolio-based language assessment that's going to be used in LINC programs across the country. And according to the PBLA Guide, action-oriented feedback moves learners forward, it gives students a way forward, it's linked to criteria, and it addresses what students need to improve. Some people might suggest that the link to criteria should be listed first in that those 4 different aspects, because all of the feedback that we give really does need to be connected to the criteria and the objectives that we had already set for our students. So that's quite a common and important point to make there. So anonymous is showing up as actually Bula. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and hopefully we'll be able to keep that in mind. Actually, there's a few anonymous we've got in the session today, 3 of you. So here are some examples of action-oriented feedback. So the next several slides that I'm going to go through are just various ways that you can incorporate action-oriented feedback into your practice. One is to use comments only. And those sticky notes are just some of the suggestions that we came up with at the LISTN office for what might be considered comments only. And there's a lot of research out there that says that when you have comments only, students are able to use that to further their learning a lot more. And one thing is that, and I'm sure a lot of you have this experience, when you have comments and grades, what do the students look at first? You might want to type that into the chat box. Grades, grades, grades. Yeah, so we're getting lots of people popping up with the notion that students look at the grades first. Barbara is commenting that students are often fixated on numbers and that, the focus being on grades and scores, and that is so common. And it's very interesting that I had the same experience myself recently when I gave this action-oriented feedback session at a conference. And when I received the feedback from the conference, one of the participants scored me and gave me an 8 out of 10. And even though there were all sorts of other comments from other conference participants, I myself even focused in on that 8 out of 10. And then I was wondering, why is it an 8 out of 10? Why aren't I a 10 out of 10? And why is this person giving me a score when there was no prompt to give me a score? And so I think it's very much ingrained. It's not just our students, but even when that kind of approach is given to us. So whenever possible, it's good if we can try to focus on giving comments only to our students before we give them a score. And there's lots of comments coming up in the chat box that comments lose their value if a score is applied, and that there's research to support this. And Marina is saying that their school has moved from rubrics to ABC grades, and how annoying that this can be. Scott from Kelowna says that their teacher ed program has done away with grades and moved to the narrative assessment of pass-fail. Oh, that would be interesting to learn more about. Sometimes the comments can illuminate the reason for the score. Absolutely. And definitely that's what you would hope, is that the comments are helping to contextualize the score. And formative assessment comment, yes, otherwise known as formative assessments, and it seems like a universal language coming from Carol. So one thing to consider then definitely is looking at the use of comments only in your feedback and holding off before you give your students a score or a grade. Another example of action-oriented feedback is, and this kind of goes back to those vague feedback in the whole sticker industry, is use action-oriented rather than ego-oriented. So if we're very specific in what it is that our students need to do to improve, or what it is specifically that they did particularly well, it's a lot more meaningful for our students than just to say like, wow, your English has improved a lot, good job. Because it doesn't tell them in what ways it's improved and in what ways they're meeting the objectives. So of course, as teachers, we use that kind of like, oh, wow, that's really fantastic, you're doing really well, or various kinds of feedback like that. But it is really important that, again, we balance that off with specifics in terms of what our students can do to improve. Another important aspect of action-oriented feedback, or ways that can make action-oriented feedback a little bit more useful in your practice, is to bring forward the use of tools and using the tools to help to focus your feedback. And the chart that I have on the screen there right now comes from the PBLA guide. And basically it's a quadrant where after students do some sort of a task, you're going to give them specific feedback in 4 areas. And you could start at any point on the grid. And there's the continue, if you look at the top left, continue, where you mention something that students are doing well and they should continue to do. And then going around like a clock, what can they start or do more of? What should they stop or do less of? And then finally, what could they consider for the future? And basically, you would take 1 or 2 points per quadrant, and I suggest writing using the imperative so that you've got action verbs that are starting off the sentence, and then it also helps to reduce your workload in terms of writing out all of the points. The PBLA guide is, as Sabine is writing down here, it's on Tutela. So if you go on to Tutela and you search out the PBLA guide, I would put in PBL Guide 2014, and then that way you'll find, because there's one I think back from 2010, which is also a great document, and then the one from 2014, and it's very user-friendly in terms of reading it. Marina is agreeing with some of the other commenters here that it's a really good tool, but there should be minimum writing in those boxes, and I agree with that, and that's part of why I'd suggest that you use the imperative when you're writing to your students, so that you're not being onerous with the amount of text that the students have to process, but also what you are writing. And Sabina is also saying the 2009 document also has some information that is absolutely amazing. I completely agree with you. They're both great documents. The PBL Guide 2014 is what is was used a lot in the development of this presentation. They're both available on Tutela. Another tool that might be useful is, particularly with lower level learners, is a modified version of it. Now this is used for kids, and some might consider it would be a little bit too juvenile with adult learners, but just the idea that you can take something and adapt it to your classroom. So this one is called 2 Stars and a Wish, where the feedback is going to focus on, okay, here are 2 things that you did very, very well, and then the wish indicating, and here's something for improvement. Again, you might want to adapt it if it's considered a little too childish, but it's used a lot in the K-12 system. I really like this last tool, which is Stop, Start, Continue. I don't have a particular template, although I will be sharing my slides later. And if you Google Stop, Start, Continue, you can get a ton of different templates available to you. So this is similar to the quadrant one, except in this case, we're only looking at 3 different actions. Similar sort of idea, where stop, what do you need to stop doing? Like what habit is happening to deter you from moving forward? What do you need to start doing, and what should you continue doing? And then we have, the 2 Stars and a Wish, same thing. It'll be on the slides when I share it, but again, if you Google, 2 Stars and a Wish, there's a ton of different templates available. And Fathia, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is saying that this is a good reflective practice for students. Absolutely. I think that it really helps to encourage reflective behavior. Another point that was this kind of, the Stop, Start, Continue is used a lot in performance evaluations in the workplace. And using it in the classroom could be a really nice preparation for when our students go out and enter into the Canadian workplace, if their goals include a career path in Canada. And I have to say that we actually used this template in the recent performance evaluation at our office. And at our office, we do the 360 evaluation. And comments were coming from a whole bunch of different people in the office, peers, people that work higher up, people that might work in something totally unrelated, and collating all of those comments for an employee. Well, what do you do with that information? So we were able to look through the various comments that were coming in, sort it into which ones were indicating, a work action that needed to stop, something to start, and something to continue. And it enabled us to have a really clear focus for working with that particular employee for how to take the information from the performance evaluation and make it add to how she's doing in the workplace. And it worked very well in the workplace, and it can work equally well into the classroom. Another aspect of action-oriented feedback is it's really important to prioritize feedback. So when we're going over a student's assignment or a task, and we might be feeling overwhelmed with how much we can focus on to help that student to move forward. But to make our lives easier, and certainly to make our students' lives easier, you really need to prioritize it. What are the 1 to 2 most important areas to address when we're giving feedback to our students. So we can't cover everything off, but we're going to focus on what's important right now, one or two things. And a couple of people saying that they agree. And then we want to have students do something with the feedback, because, you know, we can give all the written comments that we want, we can prioritize it and say that these are, you know, the one or two most important things, but unless we give our students a task to take forward, to do something with that feedback, then it might end up being a waste of time and it's not going to help our students to move forward at all. Michelle is saying, doesn't this also depend on student goals and levels? I often give lots of formative feedback, but then focus on the two most important things with higher level learners. Michelle, I think that that goes to say that how you interact with your students and you know your students well, absolutely. That maybe they've got the reflective ability to take in a lot of information in areas that they can work on, but that you as a teacher, perhaps you're going to help them to focus in on the one or two areas that perhaps is most important for this particular task. Marina's suggesting that the language be put into student words. So instead of the teacher saying, you need to do this, or you should do this, instead the student saying, I will work on this and I will stop doing that. That's a great suggestion. And Michelle is saying, I've heard them complain that it feels condescending if they're not given full feedback at higher levels. I think if you approach things with your students to let them know that there's only so much feedback that you can give them, and that you are focusing, that you give a very clear rationale for why you're doing what you're doing, then that conversation can start while you're not giving them everything in one go. And Haley is saying that it varies with students. Some will retain the feedback and immediately make connections and they can self-correct, and others need the same feedback repeatedly several times. Absolutely. Sabine is saying it's all about letting them know ahead of time what you're going to be focusing on. That is so important, Sabine, and that comes back to making sure that the feedback is linked to criteria. And so I often think about writing assignments, and if you tell your students that you're going to be focusing on 1, 2, or 3 of particular aspects of the writing, although there are a lot of other issues that might creep up in the assignments that you're getting as a teacher, it's important that your focus is on that criteria that you set ahead of time, and then making notes as an instructor that you still see that students are struggling with various different aspects, and that that's going to be for follow-up lessons in the future. And Michelle is agreeing with Haley, and that some students really benefit from just hearing 1 or 2 main points and are discouraged by too much, and tailoring it to your students is wise, absolutely. And Sabine again saying linking it to the objectives is so important, couldn't agree more. And Debbie is saying with the use of a rubric, or do you think rubrics can end up too detailed? I think rubrics can be really, really important, and unfortunately we won't have a lot of time to get into various rubrics. But there is a little bit coming up in the feedback samples where there might be some comments that come to the use of rubrics. And Michael just saying a good reminder is to stick with the criteria. Absolutely. And that's why it's really important that we give clear criteria before a task or before an assignment. Okay. So again, going back to the slide, the importance of having your students do something with that feedback. So it could be that you're getting them to totally redo the task, or perhaps you're going through and you're making them correct the mistakes based on the feedback that we're given. So there's some sort of a follow-up activity where the students are using that feedback to help them advance in what they need to do. Oh, Scott is sharing a template for the 2 stars. Fantastic, and there's a link there. And AJ is saying, this is going back to the importance of criteria, that they know the purpose of the task, and it helps them to understand what should go on the rubric. And Marina is saying, I have an issue with some students that are not ready to hear any constructive criticism. They are only defending themselves and try to tell me excuses. That's a challenge. I guess we can only do so much, but we try to stick to our guns and just try to tell them, hey, you know, as the instructor, and this is what I noticed, and this is where you need to improve. There's some great comments here. Okay. And people talking about transparency, which is really important. And that again goes back to linking to criteria. Okay. Another following on with examples of action-oriented feedback is that it's very important to be succinct, specific, and again, here we are coming back to the importance of relating to goals and to criteria. And so this goes back without overwhelming our students with our feedback, getting it into a digestible kind of chunk that they can understand and that they can process, and making sure that it's related absolutely to criteria that was set ahead of time, and then bringing it back to the student's goals. And I imagine a lot of you probably do some sort of a needs assessment with your students throughout, you know, definitely at the beginning of term and then throughout where your class is, and knowing what it is that your students are aiming to achieve and that your feedback can reflect that. So it becomes individualized for the students. And AJ is saying that he gets a little, or AJ, I don't know if that's a man or a woman. I shouldn't make that assumption. I do get a little metacognitive on them sometimes, but it takes the onus off me sometimes. They are able to understand my feedback that can often fill out their own rubrics. I think that that's quite important, where we're giving our students language about the learning process and about what it is that their goals entail. Okay. So now is the time that we're going to go and make it part of a little bit of work for you to do. Put your hands up if you were able to look at the corresponding handouts that went with this session. Okay, so about half of you, which that's great. Okay. To give you a little bit of context for what these handouts are going to be, is that I used an exemplar from the support kit, the Canadian Language Benchmark support kit, and tapped the shoulders of some of my colleagues to come up with different scenarios of how people, teachers, react to assignments and give different kinds of feedback. And so I chose one writing sample of a kind of typical task that we might do in language programs. And then we're going to look at 5 different ways that it might be assessed or corrected. And I'm going to ask you to consider whether or not the feedback on each of those samples is action-oriented. Some of them might be, some of them might not be at all. And to think about ways that you would change the feedback to make it more action-oriented. So I think the next slide is that's just a sample of one of the writing, sample. I sometimes get distracted with the things flashing up in the chat box and it gets me off track. My apologies. So this comes from the CLB support kit on page 194, and it's in response to a very simple task that the student has to write a letter to the landlord expressing that there's a problem with the heater. The heat isn't working. And we went through and did various ways that this could be assessed. Please keep in mind that it is difficult in this kind of situation is that presumably in the classroom there was set criteria and there was very specific explanations for what was expected in the writing assignment. And so the way that it's being addressed in different ways, it's not necessarily ideal, but we were looking at typical ways that people engage with writing. So here's the first sample. The instructor circled some problems and then wrote, errors are circled please correct them. And if you just want to take, a minute, and as you think about what's written there, you could write comments in the chat box. What would you do to make this sample more action-oriented? Marina's saying it's not specific enough. Exactly. It's just saying you've got some errors and correct them. Scott is saying that it would help to be connected to some criteria. Absolutely. So there is the task at the beginning, but we're not clear what the criteria for the student was beforehand. Debbie is saying to ask the student to find patterns of errors in their work. So directing them more, and then she's saying, for example, spelling. Michelle says it depends on whether you are conferencing with the student or just giving back the assignment with written comments. The purpose is here, let's pretend that their students are just getting that back without the conference with the student. Barbara says, what about peer editing, where pairs of students try to, number one, identify type of error, and two, repair it. And Michelle is saying the student should be guided through categorizing the type of error. Marina says, make it clear what type of errors. Check the verb tenses or spelling. And Svetlana says, I would start with it, see what the learner can do. After the second attempt, I would add more specific comments. Miles is commenting, can't say if it's good or not because there's no objective. Sabina said, instead of circling the errors, you could tell students there are 6 errors, 2 of which are spelling, etc. Michelle is commenting that thinks the sentence structure is pretty good. Michael comments that holistically, the student has achieved the main purpose and the teacher needs to acknowledge this success before giving an analytical evaluation. Exactly. The positive aspect of the feedback. So the task was achieved. They effectively wrote that there's a problem with the heat, but there are some other errors. And it's important to offer a little bit of both. What are they doing well, right? Think of that stop, start, continue. And then to focus in on the other errors. Some people would suggest perhaps that you need to code what those mistakes are so that students aren't feeling left like, okay, there's errors that are circled, but I have no idea what kind of error it is. So they're just at a loss. Peer evaluation is really important as well. Sometimes you have to be very hesitant about getting students to find particular language level problems, for example, spelling or verb tense and things like that. Because every once in a while, if students are generally at the same level, they might make corrections for things that aren't wrong, if you know what I mean. So sometimes for peer correction for writing, it can be better to look at more sort of, is it formatted correctly in various more sort of bigger picture areas than that. Okay, Martha is saying to always include positive points. What did they do right? Very, very important. Debbie says some students have reported that they don't like coding as it means learning yet another language. Yeah, sometimes it can be overwhelming. Sabine saying send students to Spell Check Plus. Martha says that she puts the correct form or the word when she circles it, so makes the correction there. Martha puts in explanations. Desiree is saying holistic feedback is given priority in CLB assessment. Yes, that where you go for that holistic and then you go to the analytic. Scott saying he likes the coding idea. Michelle, there was no comment about the phrase, I hope you will be good at your job. Very, very important. There's nothing grammatically wrong with that sentence, but it can be a really problematic thing to write, and that it's perhaps possible that if a landlord gets a letter where there's a sentence that says, I hope you will be good at your job, it might be possible that the heat doesn't get fixed, or it might even become colder in that person's apartment. So that's a very, very important point. And yeah, AJ is saying, let's not ignore the pragmatics mistake. And it's not easily fixable, and sometimes people may just ignore it because there's nothing technically wrong with the grammar there or the spelling or anything else like that, but it can have huge implications towards, yeah, the pragmatics. And Nile is saying this is why we need a rubric. Okay, let's look at the second sample here. It's exactly the same writing sample, but it just comes down to good work, your spelling needs improvement. You can probably find that some of our comments about this would be repeated Svetlana saying bad. How is it good? Right, how is it good? That's very vague. What is good about this, right? What does good work mean in this context? Scott is saying, student would then say, well, how do I improve my spelling? Exactly. Well, what tools are you going to give me to help me to improve my spelling? Yvonne is saying that the errors need to be identified and the student needs to find the correct spelling. Absolutely, where there's an action involved there. Eli says, I guess this feedback is based on task achievement. Scott says, you know, we need a way forward. There's no way forward in this particular sample. Desiree is wondering, would anybody else comment on spacing? Oh my goodness, we only have 15 minutes left. Okay, so there's various aspects that come forward, and some of the things that, would you comment on spacing, would you comment on spelling, and various aspects like that, I think that comes to what criteria are you going to cover with your students? What have you told them prior, and how is that addressed in your feedback? Okay, here is sample C. It might be a little bit small for you. I'll see if I can increase the space a little bit. Basically, it's, for example, a word type where it's sent in electronically, and then the instructor is making feedbacks throughout. And basically, it's coming through. And for those, the SW1, that stands for my initials. That's not a particular code for marking. But check the spelling. This is the wrong verb choice. Check spacing, check spelling, and then word choice. And there's that sentence. The sentence is awkward. The landlord could be offended. Please revise. And there's all sorts of suggestions coming forward in the chat box here. And AJ says that he does this sometimes, especially with essays. Boy, oh boy, is it time consuming, but the students love it. Desiree says none of it's prioritized. Debbie is saying that this could be overwhelming for the students. Hannah says the student may not feel that the teacher has put in any effort into what needs to be addressed. So it's just picking up on everything that's wrong. It could be overwhelming. The feedback should be more specific to help the students correct themselves. And students may love it, but do they act on it? I think that's really, really important. Students will often say that they want you to correct every single mistake, but if you ask them to go back and fix every single mistake, they might not love it so much. So if you can prioritize it and you choose a few of the errors that people need to work on, and then that gives them that forward action that, okay, here's where we're going. This is what you need to work on. Ara saying we can't spoon feed them. That's a really important aspect. Okay, I'm going to move on here, and I'll make this a little bit smaller. Here is a variation of where there's a kind of a rubric used. So there's a holistic that it meets the task requirement or not, and then broken down into analytic. I can tell you based on experience from having done this workshop before, it's probably best not to pull language directly from the CLBs, but to make sure that you adapt it so that it's digestible and understandable to your students. So it's in student-friendly language, not necessarily in teacher-specific language. The feedback down here is using a variation of stop, start, continue, saying good points, avoid, and improve. And, you know, it might be better to just say stop, start, continue. Desiree is saying using a color other than red can be psychologically easier. Absolutely, and I'm sure a number of you use other colors such as turquoise or purple or various things. I've once heard that green should be avoided because green means go, and it might give the impression that everything is okay. So that's true. And Scott's saying a good point about creating plain text rubrics, right, in student-friendly language. And again, Millet is saying students might not understand some of the phrasing, there's too much teacher language. So that's a lot of what's going on here. And sorry, went the wrong way. Again, this particular sentence is highlighted, at least in this particular example, the teacher is saying that we need to work on this together. And I think for most of you as teachers, when you come across something like, I hope you will be good at your job, that's an important enough error that's happening in this that you would probably want to come back to the whole class and doing a bit of a mini lesson on why this is inappropriate and in terms of the language. Here's the last sample for the writing. And what you'll notice is that every single error has been corrected by the instructor. And then the feedback at the very bottom is the sandwich approach. So it's following what we were talking about earlier. So the written feedback at the end likely needs to be reordered in such a way that it is more action oriented and divided up so that it's clear to the student what's good and what needs work. And there can be a lot of debate on the usefulness of making corrections directly for our students, because if we make the corrections, is there a forward action where that they have to go and make those corrections themselves? So it can be tricky. Desiree is making a comment that even check marks and circles can be culturally coded, and that a check mark in Japan, for example, means wrong and a circle means correct. Yes, absolutely. I had that experience when I was working in Japan myself. Debbie says, seeing not yet without an explanation isn't as valuable, or almost. They need to know how to get there. Oh, that goes back to the rubric. Absolutely. I can't increase the font very much, but I can try to pull it forward. There, I'll show you the sandwich approach. Okay. We only have a little bit of time left, and so I'm going to move on to the speaking sample. And this one, you're going to need to open up a new tab or a new window to find the last minute of a speaking sample, which is from the support kit, but available online. So here are the steps that you need to go through. And what I'm going to ask is that once you have finished step 6 and you come back to this Realize forum, that you put your hand up so that I know when I can start forward with going through the sample. So step 1, you need to open up a new window or tab. Then you're going to go to the hyperlink that is in right there, bookshelf.language.ca. You need to select the exemplars tab. It's in the middle once you get there. Find the speaking for exemplar, press play, and you need to forward it to the 3-minute 50-second mark and watch it until the end of the 5-minute 30-second mark. So just over an hour, a minute, and then come back and join us on Big Blue Button. In the interest of time, and I know that not everybody is back yet, but because we only have 5 minutes, I do want to quickly go through just a few of these samples. Feel free to write in the comments box. I might have a little bit of a challenge keeping up with everyone. But in this first one, there is the feedback for the woman talking about making tamales. And in sample number 1, there's language lifted directly from the CLBs of certain strengths and limitations, and the instructor is commenting on those in terms of the feedback. It's quite small, but it basically this information is taken directly from the Canadian language benchmarks, which might be too difficult for the students to digest. It's not in student-friendly language. And then there's all comments. And one thing as teachers, we see a blank space, and we want to put information. But sometimes we can leave things blank. Just because there's a space for comments, it doesn't mean you have to fill in that particular space. So one thing to keep in mind as a way to help prioritize the feedback. Here's another suggestion where it's more of a rubric, but it's a rating scale out of 5, but there's no indication to the students what a 1 is or what a 5 is. Is 1 good? Is 5 good? That kind of information needs to be very, very clear for our students. The language, again, needs to be more student-friendly. And these comments, I keep on trying review vocabulary for food. And it's so vague, and really is her vocabulary for food the most problematic issue that she's having? I think there are other more important areas that she could work on. In the third sample, this is spoken feedback, and it's basically telling the student, working on certain strategies. And you could argue that those are perhaps more important, because when she falters, giving her suggestions for, well, when you can't remember what a word is, and so that you have certain gambits that they did in class last week and to review it. So in this case, it's the teacher who looks a bit like a hipster, but I wanted to make it clear that this was spoken, and giving that kind of feedback in that way. Michelle says that they often give some verbatims, like, this is what you said. And I think that that is a really important aspect to make. Sample number 4 is using that quadrant that we discussed earlier, about going around, start and do more, stop or do less, consider and continue. And it might be a little bit text dense. We might work at trying to make it more concise, but at least it contextualizes it, and it's giving 4 simple or 4 specific ways of getting back to it. And here's another one. Perhaps in that class you've been working on various things, but for each student you're just going to give them 2 points to work on. And so in this case, perhaps number 1, let's work at sequence order more, and number 2, let's work on pronunciation to make yourself understood more clearly. And perhaps maybe the text in the comments isn't perfect, but it's one way to help to prioritize the feedback. Okay. I wish we had more time. I'm going to quickly get through on Sherry's saying start using audio recordings to assist when providing feedback, and I've had lots of people saying using things like Vocaloo to capture your audio feedback or your verbal feedback so that it's captured so that the student can reflect on it later. Just to sum up in the last minute, it is really important that you use different kinds of feedback. The feedback's not always coming from the teacher. There's opportunities for peer feedback, and that some people need a lot of training with that, but it's absolutely valuable, and certainly times for self-feedback and self-reflection. So using all of those in your feedback strategies in the class. Find ways to incorporate feedback into your lesson plans. Here's the further reading that I mentioned earlier. You'll have access to my slides at a later point. I really recommend this particular article. It was very useful to me. At the LISTN office, we put together a 2-pager. It's hyperlinked. There's some digestible 2-page on action-oriented feedback, which can be very helpful. Getting to the instructor competencies, I certainly hope that we were able to touch on some of these that I discussed at the very, very beginning. And then finally, I don't know if you can read that, but the cowboy is saying to the horse, you've been a pretty good horse, I guess. Hard working, not the fastest critter I ever come across, but, and then the horse says to the cowboy, no, stupid, not feed back. I said I wanted to feed bag. And I think it's just reminding us as teachers that sometimes we take ourselves a little too seriously, and it's good to try to keep things on a light note from time to time as well. Thank you very, very much. I've gone a minute over. I really enjoyed your comments, and thank you for joining me.